Gentlemen, the time has come once again to discuss things.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentleman History Month. I am Sid Partu. Joining me today is the one, the only Steve Baxey.
Hello.
And we are, of course, continuing Geeky Gentleman History Month, the month in which we discuss the contributions that geeky gentlemen have made to history, but that have been ignored by its educational system, except not at all. So, initially this week we were supposed to be talking about King Arthur, but something fell through with trying to get someone to come on for that. And then we were like, well, maybe we should do something with like we did with Frankenstein, where it transitioned between, between the themes, since we're doing a holiday month next month. So, who's a historical figure that's connected to the holidays? Jesus.
Yeah.
And, We're just going heavy this year on History Month, man. I posted a whole tweet combining different segments of all the heavy ass shit we talked about this year. It's got sexual assault, pedophilia, nuclear ethics.
It's been kind of a heavy month. It's been kind of a heavy year. It's been a kind of heavy half decade, honestly.
Yeah.
I just could not dial that back.
Yeah, the good days are gone, man.
What's that meme everyone keeps posting of people say the world wasn't supposed to end on 2012, but has anyone felt alive since then? I guess not.
Man. There was a rapture, but no one was pure enough to leave. Which connects us back to our topic. We're talking about Jesus, and this will be, it's heavy because, religion is often kind of inherently controversial, especially since we're talking about the Messiah of a religion of which neither of us practice. Yeah,
I was going to say, maybe it should be prefaced that neither one of us are overtly religious or even believe in a god, so...
Yeah. I'm an atheist, you're an atheist, so... But I do want to establish something, because I feel like, atheism gets kind of an annoying rap.
Because of atheists?
Yeah, because of atheists. Richard Dawkins, all them. So, my wife is a Christian, all my family members are Christian. I don't hate people that are Christians, I don't think you're stupid if you're a Christian or anything like that, so... I don't know, maybe you'll listen to this and find something interesting within it, who knows?
Honestly, for me, the biggest avenues of interest for Jesus come more in relation to him as a kind of literary character and him as an ethical framework. I'm not even really... It's the kind of thing where, if I ever tell someone I'm a philosophy student, they'll be like, so do you believe in God? And my response to that, in my head at least, is always... After you get past, the age of 17, whether or not God exists doesn't matter. Most of the interesting stuff in theology is, let's presume he did, then what?
Yeah.
I don't entirely care whether or not we're talking about whether or not Jesus was a real person. I don't think that matters.
I've always been of the opinion that I thought Jesus was, a real dude that existed, and then, he just kind of got, the cult surrounding him kind of took over and made him Messiah retroactively.
Sure.
That's what a lot of Jewish people tend to believe too, is that Jesus did actually exist. And there's been, obviously there's a lot of fake stuff, but there's been corroborating facts. So the way history works, as far as like from a research perspective, is you take accounts of people who were there, or first or secondhand accounts of people who were there to witness the event, and then you look for like any kind of, documentation from a verifiable source as to whether or not this actually happened. So, you got like the stories about Jesus, which is, okay, those are the accounts. Now, what do you have to line up with this? And of course, if he was real, he was like a nobody as far as, record keepers and stuff would be concerned. But what else about him can you look at that might corroborate some of the stories told about him? And, I think one of the best pieces of evidence in regards to that is they found Pontius Pilate's grave. So that was a real dude.
Yeah.
And so
well, I think it's gotten to the point where even a lot of Christians and Christian apologists, they don't really feel the need to argue whether or not Jesus was a historical figure, because I think there's enough evidence to say that there was a dude in that general area doing that general thing named potentially Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of those things where, like, it's not a fact, but, like, I don't think you lose or gain much by admitting he existed either way.
Yeah, that's what I tend to go for, too. So, like, I don't know, the other thing about it to me is if you remove the religious context, the philosophy of Jesus is something that is just exceptionally rare for that time period.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, right? Like, I think ultimately Christianity, flaws and cultural problems all aside, I think the most powerful and most interesting thing about Jesus as a figure in that ethical framework is the concept of forgiveness.
Yeah, especially coming from Judaism.
Yeah.
And, their version of God is, I am a vengeful God. I am a jealous God, right?
Yeah. I mean, just the idea that, like, and I think it gets problems here and there when you get into the technicalities of the religion, but just as a religious concept, particularly in a world more dominated prior to our present day by Eastern concepts of, like, polytheistic gods and, like, redemption and being reborn and all that other stuff in a more, like, almost Buddhist, Hindu, or even Greek sense, the idea to just say you did something wrong and you're sorry is almost entirely new.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether or not you're talking about, like, I guess, apologizing or redemption for that version of God, you get into more technicalities. But the idea of, like, of Jesus as a person just saying, like, no, it's not good to hate things. That you probably shouldn't hate things. You should let it go.
Yeah, and there's, like, contradictions, of course, even within the stuff he says. But still, just in a real general sense, I feel like a lot of that could reasonably be explained away by the canonization process, right?
Yeah, sure.
I don't feel like a lot of it's, you gotta understand the Bible as a historical document, not as a document that shows you history, but as a document that was historically constructed.
Yeah.
And so you get to pick and choose with it in a unique way that I don't feel like people let happen as much with other religions, or people don't want to let happen. I've heard people say stuff like, "Oh, you can't pick and choose from your book if you think it's the absolute truth." I'm like, yeah, but what if you think it's a flawed document created by people? If you're reasonable enough to admit that, can you pick and choose then? Yes. It's an interesting little thing there, but. For me, I really like a lot of the stories and the fables of Jesus. I like the moment in the trial with Pontius Pilate where the whole thing is about having faith, having just the ability to believe without having to have things proved for you. And I think that serves as an interesting metaphor to be seen down the line of, like, I never have to prove anything to any of you. You just need to believe in me. I think that was one of the things that always stuck with me as kind of interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, faith as a concept particularly there because so much of religion prior to that point, people just kind of accepted in the most literal way possible, and sometimes they still kind of do. But at least in relation to Jesus and like the sort of idea of faith not only in a thing outside of yourself, but a faith in yourself is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's sort of, what's that Kierkegaard quote of like, a man defends his faith, let the comedy begin. It's really demeaning, but that guy was a very devout Christian. He had a very particular idea of like a faith towards something making you better, and I think that was always interesting in relation to Jesus. There's a really cool piece of symbolism in the Solomon Kane movie, which Ian, I told you about last time, where, because I mean, Solomon Kane's a Puritan, so and in that universe, the Christian God exists, and that's just how things are. But there's a really cool scene in that movie where Solomon Kane gets crucified, literally, and he rips his hands out of the screws holding him down. And it's done almost like, that's the entire scene is shot almost like it's divine intervention. And given who Solomon Kane is, that faith in that context is really interesting, to like do things that are beyond human because you have a faith in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. It's where's something else we can go with on Jesus then?
Well, so part of what I think is interesting, because one of my favorite works of art of all time is Paradise Lost. And Paradise Lost has a really interesting, at the time controversial, and now a little more accepted idea. Because in that poem or book, however you want to phrase it, God's painted very clearly as kind of an asshole. And I'm not even talking about like you read the Bible and you come to the conclusion that he might be. Like in that story for Milton, God is an asshole. He's going to a very particular extreme in that book, and you're made to see Lucifer as almost more altruistic and sympathetic. And I kind of like that, because I always think Lucifer as a character is a really fascinating idea. I kind of like that parallel between Lucifer and Satan. Like it's always like God and the devil that gets bounced back and forth. But I think the idea of Jesus being God, the Son of God, and Lucifer being like God's favorite angel, like the both being siblings in that way, I think is an interesting framework that that book kind of dealt with. Mm-hmm. Particularly because I don't think either one of them are particularly great or awful people in their own right.
Interesting. You know, do you accept the interpretation that Jesus was tempted by the devil in the desert? Because they never actually say it's the devil in the original text, right? They just say a tempter came to him and offered him the whole world if he'd just kiss his hand or something like that.
I've always liked that story better if it wasn't the devil, because I think it's more interesting if it's Jesus in a very material place denying material pleasure.
Okay, because I always, I remember watching some special or something at one point, and the devil shows up and he actually takes Jesus to space and shows him literally the globe.
That's kind of badass.
Yeah, and it's like, I can give you the whole world, and I'm just like, I've always kind of thought back on that in my head of well, that must be a really shocking image to just a guy from the desert. It's like, holy shit, the Earth is round? What?
What are all these tiny suns all over the place? What's happening?
Yeah, there's wait, what's that continent over there? No, but I always like that interpretation that it was the devil, because it's about as mythological as the Bible, as particularly the New Testament and the Bible ever gets. You got Genesis, you got the Ark, and I don't know, a couple other small moments in the Old Testament that are proper myth. In the New Testament, it's just Jesus went here and said some stuff, and Jesus went over here and said some stuff. But it's Jesus and the devil. I really like that, just from a literary point of view, classic mythology point of view, because it feels like proper myth. That Jesus is tempted by the ultimate tempter, Satan himself, just as you will be tempted in your life, and he refused it, so you have to as well. I really, really like it's just that perfect, concise moral tale.
I mean, I definitely dig that. I think part of it is that even as a kid, I never saw the devil as a bad person. Because, okay, so I didn't grow up in a Christian family at all. I like the idea of Christianity being the moral norm of the West was not a thing that registered to me until I was much, much, much older. So I had like the concept of Lucifer explained to me before I had any idea that the devil was a bad thing. So like legitimately, I first heard, so there was this angel that didn't agree with the way God was running things and decided to rebel, and God sent him to be the ruler of hell. And then I didn't connect the dot of like, oh, that person is called the devil or Satan. So I see that, but like I've never seen Lucifer as a tempter. I've never seen him as I don't know. I never saw him as like the type of person who went out of his way to ruin things. I always saw him as really, really impassioned, maybe with a bit too much of hubris, and that got him in trouble. So I mean that's interesting, and I definitely see like that sort of perfect moral tale that you're describing it as. But then at the same time, I also just see it as, if I want to think of Jesus as a person, and I want to think of him as independent, at least psychologically and materially, from God, I find it a lot more interesting to think of him as like, he doesn't find things cosmically powerful tempting. He just finds the fact that he's being in the world requires him to want certain things, and he resists those things he wants. I think there's a much more narrow human idea of, it's not a matter of what you want, it's just that really basic question of, you want things. You by the nature of existing in the world, you're gonna want things, and you have to curb that on some places.
Yeah, I find that aspect of the philosophy really interesting too. I guess that kind of goes to the whole thing that kind of confuses everybody. Like when Christians are terrible at explaining it. The Trinity makes no goddamn sense, though.
I don't get it.
No, it really doesn't.
Have you seen Hail Caesar?
No.
You need to see Hail Caesar, because there's a scene, because that movie's about a movie studio making a movie about a Roman who encounters Jesus. And it's like set in the 60s, and there's a scene where the head of the movie studio invites a bunch of different religious clerks to like talk to them about the script and make sure like he's not offending any of them. And they all sit there and have like a 5-minute argument about the Trinity. And like one of them is like, Jesus is who is, and it's like, what's the big deal with that? Who isn't who is? And it's the best thing ever.
Yeah, like it's so funny to hear the different sects of Christianity bicker over the Trinity, because like I think ultimately it was kind of symptomatic of people at the time not really thinking it through all the way. Yep. And it kind of goes back to, again, I feel like the man Jesus probably was trying to make a point that went over people's heads, and the nuance was lost on them. Yeah. But like Haley and I were taking for a brief time while we were engaged, we were taking courses with her pastor, and he tried to explain the Trinity, and he's like, well, the Catholics like to use the 3-leaf clover to explain the Trinity, but they're wrong. And I'm like,
damn, dude.
No, that's just always what it is. If you ask any sect to explain it, the other sects are all wrong. These guys have the right answer. It's that kind of like perfect go-to, and it always cracks me up. There's such a lack of objectivity in things. It always cracks me up. But yeah, like the Trinity never made any sense to me, and I've heard people try to explain it. Like, have you ever heard the forms of water metaphor?
Yeah.
Yeah, like the ice, water, vapor, they're all the same thing. It's like, not really.
I don't... That whole combination of things just really bothers me, because I think Jesus isn't interesting as God. Jesus is interesting as the Son of God.
Yeah, I really, really like Dogma by Kevin Smith. There's a great scene in that movie where the voice of God comes to talk to Jesus's last remaining relative, and that was pretty controversial in and of itself. But he goes up to her and he's like, "Yeah, I had to explain to this poor 12-year-old boy not only that he was the Son of God, but he was the embodiment of God himself, and that one day he would have to die for these people." And he cried and asked me to take it all back, and if I had the power, I would have. God, I just love that scene so much. It's one of the best It gets all the emotion, I feel, that people try to convey when they talk about things like the Trinity, and they talk about the weird, intricacies of Christian faith without necessarily giving into. It's like, it's not asking you to accept it, it's just asking you to understand these are the emotions people feel when they talk about these things.
Yeah.
And I really, really like that scene for that.
And I think there's also a part of... There's a certain appeal with that, almost in the reverse direction of, like, sometimes you don't want to humanize them that much either, and you want to think of them as being able to bear this with a very mythological power, and that's also comforting. That's sort of like, I don't need Superman to have my problems because I want to think of Superman in a more idealistic way.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is kind of fun to go back and forth with that, because I feel like there can be a lot done with the sort of, like, poor farmer background, and then at the same time the sort of, I recognize I have all these powers and now nothing's really a problem thing.
Yeah, and then there's other stuff that just, like, gets dropped that I would find more interesting to read. And I know I've seen, like, people do imaginings and stuff of this, but, like, the lost years, because, like, okay, we know of the birth, and then there's usually, like, one story where they're in Jerusalem, I think, and he kind of wanders off from his parents and is talking to some rabbis, and they're all really fascinated in what he has to say. And then next time he's 30, you know?
Jesus goes to the mountain and has all those tempting experiences over the course of 30 days, right?
40 days.
40 days. Okay, 40 days. Because I remember with Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the idea was that Zarathustra did it for like 30 or 40 years. And like sort of the point of that book was that let's reconcile what Jesus would be with even more perspective than we're allowed to have from him.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Let me ask you this, because you brought up the Superman example, and something I've thought for a long time is if you like the savior metaphor, and a lot of religions have the idea of the savior, right?
Yeah.
If you like the savior metaphor, one thing I've always thought is that Superman's probably a better Jesus figure than Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why is because the ultimate problem that I tend to have when we talk about Christianity and the forgiveness thing is it's forgiveness without personal responsibility.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, like, you're supposed to ask for forgiveness through Jesus, through God, but not necessarily from those you have wronged.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that's always bothered the hell out of me. Whereas I really like the Superman thing of, Superman goes and dies for humanity, and that inspires everyone to be better because he died for us. He didn't die asking us to forgive each other.
Yeah. I mean, this goes to the whole, like, I've always had a problem with the idea of original sin.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've always had, like, the more basic, even I guess existential idea of, like, nobody really chose to be here. We got thrown here, and I shouldn't have to apologize just for existing. Yeah,
is it unethical to have children?
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Because, like, ultimately you would think, and I mean, this is a point my friend brought up, who's extremely generous when it comes to Christian apologetics and stuff, but, like, if you're really looking at this from the perspective of there are people who think of Jesus and the Bible and God in a very literal sense, then you have to look at the extreme fringe groups, like, say, the Westboro Baptist Church, and say that given how they feel about what the Bible is in a literal way, they're kind of doing the right thing. Not that they're good people, because they're not. But if you genuinely thought the entire world was going to hell because God was vengeful for you not agreeing with him, then this kind of makes sense.
Oh, definitely.
And that's sort of terrifying.
No, I agree. And again, that's just kind of the things of contradictions within the Bible that tend to bother me over time and stuff like that. So it's why I very few kids start poking holes in in the teachings of Christ before they start poking holes in the Old Testament, right? When they're like kind of going through that thinking phase of wondering about the religion their parents have put them into. And I think that's kind of where a lot of people diverge, is they either, you know, they kind of notice some of the weirdness, the strangeness, and then they break away, or they start questioning it more and more, or they just kind of go, no, I have to accept it because of what have you, because of an intense belief at their root. And I don't know, it's one of those things where I think it kind of makes you scratch your head a little bit and just wonder what could be and what is the logical end of this, you know?
Yeah, and I guess speaking to your like Superman's a better Jesus than Jesus thing, there's sort of a lot of that, because I've always there's a popular thing in annoying atheism where they're like, well, Christianity just stole everything from all these other older religions. I think that's a really uneducated way to look at it. But I always thought it was interesting to compare Superman and Jesus on the same level of, as far as savior figures go, these two are probably the youngest. Even though there's like 2,000 years of separation, not 2,000, but like 1,900 years of separation between Jesus and Superman, they're both pretty much in the same age range. Like the closest other one to Jesus is 5,000 years older than Jesus. So,
yeah.
Like, just thinking in those terms, I think that, like, I think a lot of other religions had more, and particularly like talking from the context of like ancient Sumerian religion and Christian Hinduism and stuff like that. A lot of those gods had a more particular agency in relation to humanity. Like in the Hindu epic, the gods were the generals of a vastly human army.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a fundamentally different thing than the level of separation someone like Jesus maintains when God and the devil go to war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because like God doesn't put the human race in the trenches, right?
Right. I mean, because it's like the fate of humanity is decided without the agency of humanity, and Jesus is just kind of like our gestured kind of like you still matter kind of thing. Whereas when you track backwards, because of how literal a lot of these religions were at those points in history, the idea of you just walking up to a castle and talking to God like he's literally sitting there, that wasn't bizarre. Your agency mattered in the sense that the people that physically ruled you were physically there.
Mm-hmm. It's weird. Religion is really, really weird. And I think part of it is like it's this. There needs to be a level of just intellectual thought and just process and dogma about how these things would necessarily have to work, right?
Yeah.
Like that needs to be done, but at the same time, it's something that develops naturally from a people, gets standardized later, and then has to spread out further and still be understandable all the way through. And so it's just got a lot of like weird little intricacies and things. Like I don't think you'll ever find a religion that makes perfect sense just on a glance.
Yeah.
And so it's just a neat way to see how those things evolve from like a historical perspective. Haha, because it's History Month.
Well, and also, I guess, to transition, but also from a perspective of, like, worship, of, like, religions aren't necessarily there for us to be able to track them perfectly as a historical discourse that we want to be literal, because if we do that, we end up with a kind of extremism like Westboro Baptist Church. Mm-hmm. But then on the other end of the spectrum, to the extent that, like, someone like Jesus can hold up to enough scrutiny to make us feel like he's there for us and we celebrate that is also good and interesting. Like Superman Day in the US, I think is a very particular kind of ritualistic warmth that like Christmas does. Not nowhere near the same level of cultural presence, but on a personal level, at least for me, it sort of feels the same way.
Yeah, for people that like Superman, I think it is. you know.
Well, and also from the perspective of like you see people talk about how, like, say they were bullied as a child and they read comic books and like they look up to Superman or Batman in a very particular way that I think cognitively is very similar to the way religious people look up to Jesus.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see that, like, I remember a couple years back, the Westboro Baptist Church protested Comic-Con.
Yeah.
Because they saw them as, like, I remember their statement said something to the effect of, quit worshiping your golden calves.
Yeah.
And, yeah, I do think that, you know, Grant Morrison everyone's made the point that superheroes are in modern day mythology. Grant Morrison's probably done the most to really ground that in the U.S. But, you know, they do fill that role of mythology. They do fill a role of giving us moral standards to go by. And sure, you probably shouldn't get all of your moral standing from comic books, but there are definitely worse places to start.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure.
So, like, comic book characters do tend to embody that role for a lot of people. Like, you know, I don't think it's weird when I see people get tattoos of crosses or, fuck, I'm ignorant. What's the moon called in Islam?
I don't know.
Shit, I'm sorry, people.
I was going to say, in my head, I was thinking you were going to go for Star of David, but then...
No, I knew Star of David. I was trying to remember the moon. Like, I've seen, you know, people get tattoos of all this religious imagery. I've seen tattoos of Buddha and stuff like that. I've also seen so many superhero tattoos. And it's always the logo, and it's like... It's the same kind of thing. And what's more is, you can be into both. Like, let me ask you this, and this is kind of an interesting way to bring this, because this is a question I kind of find myself wondering about quite a bit. Superman Christian?
I think so.
You do?
I think so.
I go back and forth on this so much.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I think that there are stages in his life where clearly he has to be.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's a infant to, say, 12-year-old Clark Kent growing up in a farm on Kansas that isn't Christian.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I think after that it's really debatable, but I like to think he is only on the level that like he is that because of that sort of profound respect for his mother and father. And I don't like people writing the Kents as anything but sort of salt of the earth, really country, almost conservative people. Just because I think contextually that makes so much sense.
No, it does. It really, really, truly does. And that's the thing for me. Like, I believe he was raised Christian. I believe that he believed in Christ and all that stuff growing up. I don't know if he, you know, continues that into adulthood. Like,
and I think there are particular stories and parts of the DC universe where I feel like he has to reconcile whether or not he believes that with what he's seeing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I feel like there's a story to be told of the first time Superman fought Darkseid, and he doesn't know if he's a Christian anymore because of what Darkseid is.
That could be interesting, yeah. It's just one of those things where I go back and forth on it. And I think the reason why is because, you know, Jesus... I so wonder if Jesus bought into whether or not he was literally the Son of God, or I debate whether or not he was saying that we are all children of God. But, like, it's so weird for me to think of another religious figure that believed in the previous one and continued to after they began their movement, right?
Yeah.
And so Superman's that weird exception for that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, there was a very particular... Because I remember when the first Avengers movie came out, there was a lot of talk, weirdly, in a lot of, like, sort of bizarre need to justify the line when Captain America's like, there's only one God, and he doesn't dress like that.
Really? People didn't just accept that Steve Rogers was Christian?
See, that's my thing. I'm like, this dude is a rich white... Not rich. He's a white guy from New York City in the 1900s, like early 1920s, 1930s. You're saying you can't accept him as Christian, really?
Yeah,
Like,
that's
I know
ridiculous.
Rick Remender was doing something highly uncontroversial and natural when he made Captain America have to deal with the fact that he was racist. And people were like, no, Captain America should be racist. I'm like, I don't know. This dude grew up in the 40s. He may not think he is, but he could be doing things that are racist.
Yeah.
That doesn't.
Yeah.
I don't think that's damaging. I think that's just human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, we are products in a lot of ways of the society we're in. It's when we address and what we choose to do with that information, right?
Yeah. So, like, with someone like Captain America, like, I don't think anyone at this point, really, in the comics, I did with the movie. I don't know why with the movie, but in the comics, I don't think anyone's going to question, yeah, Captain America's Christian. Might be something more specific than vaguely Christian. Maybe, like, there's a family lineage thing, or even, like, a creator thing where, like, maybe Steve Rogers is Jewish or something. But, like, he's of that Judeo-Christian tradition in some way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly because I think that there are a lot of characters in comics that have very particular faiths, and I feel like we try to dance around them too much. I like that Nightcrawler is religious, and I wish we did that again.
Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, to get back to Jesus, though, so one thing I want to make sure we talk about is, like, different tellings of Jesus or reinterpretations with Jesus. Do you have, like, a particularly favored version of the story that you've seen?
It's hard to say.
I can go first. I really, really like the original film of Jesus Christ Superstar. And like, you laugh. I think that is a great freaking telling of the Jesus story. Like, I love the scene with all the lepers.
Yeah.
Where they're like, touch me, Christ, can you heal me, Christ? Like, that's really, really good. And it works a lot in a modern context because they straight up just, have Judas resurrected and sit there and give kind of the modern argument against Jesus. Like, why did you come in a time without a form of mass communication? If you'd shown up today, you could have reached an entire nation. And really tellingly to me, in that song, Jesus is silent because that kind of misses the point in a lot of ways. And I really, really like that interpretation. I highly recommend the musical of Jesus Christ Superstar. And for those in my audience that are atheists and don't really want to watch like a Jesus story, you can get a lot out of that because that musical is written by agnostics and atheists.
I mean, I kind of dig that that's what you picked, because then, if that's the case, have you ever read Sean Murphy's Punk Rock Jesus?
No.
Okay. It's a miniseries that came out a few years back from Vertigo. Basic idea was there was a weird cloning project where they cloned Jesus, and then they educated him in like a really closed off, secluded area, and then he grows up, breaks out, and just becomes a punk rocker. And he legit talks about the Bible and faith and forgiveness and those ideas in an extremely theistic way, but just as a punk dude. And it's awesome. Like, he's you don't literally have a soundtrack, and I wish this could get adapted because I want this to have a soundtrack, but like, he's just on stage with like a mohawk and like chains and stuff, yelling about how good it is to forgive people.
Oh, that's adorable.
Like, that's kind of awesome. And I particularly, I also sort of like there was an early like 1980s trend of like secular theism that's bizarre, at least when you start thinking about the way those words work. But sort of the idea being that you can adapt old religions by forcing them against a modern current, saying that you don't have to stick to the Bible. You have to stick to what the Bible means in the context in which you're reading it. So I like the idea of culturally who we are right now. How would we as a people read the Bible as opposed to how we were taught to read it? And in that sense, I think Punk Rock Jesus is a really cool experiment.
That's really interesting. I had something and then I lost it. That's okay.
Sorry.
Nah, it's cool. All right. I think you got anything else you want to talk about with Jesus? I like that we got together on an evening, two buds, just talk about Jesus. I should text my mom that.
I will say I'm disappointed that the thumbnail for this video does not include a random picture off to the sidelines of Ewan McGregor.
Man, my bad.
That would have been a great joke. And I'm not going to explain why, but it's really obvious, and you should get it.
That's fair. I don't know. I wanted to find a black Jesus, but I couldn't find any good images of black Jesus. Oh, by the way, Jesus is black.
Yeah. No, he has to be. Fuck anyone says not. But
anyway, okay, that's it. Then that'll do it for this episode. Let's see here. What are we going to talk about next time as we go into holiday month?
Do we have a holiday theme? I don't actually know.
Just holiday in general. So I need to
holiday characters.
Yeah. So characters that are closely tied to the holiday. Or holidays.
Santa.
I mean, nose hitting it a little too hard.
Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
Okay, like here's the restriction here. How the fuck are we going to talk about Rudolph for an hour or half an hour? Like, come on now, give me a little. Like, what are we going to say? Rudolph is a great metaphor for the persecution of the disabled. Like,
okay. So maybe not that. Maybe we can talk about. Okay. Here's one that's actually got multiple interpretations that might actually work out in a more interesting discussion. Jack Frost.
Jack Frost. Cool. Works for me. All right. Everyone, thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I'm the Philosopher.
And I'm the Exile.
And we are your Geeky Gentlemen. And we will be discussing things.